Just 1 year after this act is passed, Britain's admission to the European Economic Community is agreed upon in principle and was formally ratified 3 years later in 1972. Now, there are two more important pieces of immigration legislation that passed in the post-war period. That is the 1971 Immigration Act and the 1981 British Nationality Act. But I won't go into detail with these because I do realize that there is like a maximum amount of time that people want to listen to the legal history of immigration controls with it before they resort to like tearing the skin from their face. But suffice to say that both of these acts again targeted the black and brown citizens of the former British Empire. Even the name of these acts is revealing. So like the first act, the British Nationality Act of 1948, which refers explicitly to these groups as British, is followed then by a series of quote-unquote immigration acts. So we're seeing that these groups are being linguistically downgraded from British to immigrant. So what's the overall point I'm trying to make here? Well, it's that borders are relative. They exist much more for some groups of people than they do for others. They're not egalitarian and they're not applied in this like universal way. And we see this very clearly when we look at the history of borders, because every example of border control that I've discussed in this episode has targeted a specific group of people, even if they were supposedly ostensibly about immigration as a whole. I think the term border in and of itself can encourage this kind of abstraction because, a border is not like a human thing, We think of a border as like a physical, inanimate object. And where they're constructed in that way, the notion that borders could be discriminatory does not seem very logical. But we saw very clearly how the discrimination of the border plays out in the examples that we've discussed here. So within the British history section, we talked about the 1905 Aliens Act, which created a border that only really existed for Eastern European Jews. Then in the post-war era, we discussed a succession of Commonwealth immigration acts that again recreated the border, but this time only for the black and brown subjects of the former British Empire. And the reason that borders were continually reconstructed in these ways to selectively exclude certain groups of people was because of concerns regarding Britain's so-called absorption capacity. So this was the notion that British communities could only absorb so much migration at one time without causing some kind of like mass chaos. Essentially, the discussion around absorption capacity that we see in the post-war era could be viewed as a kind of theoretical descendant of the eugenics discussions that we were seeing so much in the early 20th century, because the core assumptions are more or less the same, right? So discussions of absorption capacity also relied on categorizing human beings into desirable and undesirable groups, because it was only certain groups of migrants who were perceived as being substantively different from native British stock that were thought to require absorption. Like a white Australian migrant wouldn't really be subject to this kind of debate because they were thought to be culturally and phenotypically similar to the British stock. And arguably, some of the discussions that we have today around migrant integration is yet another iteration of this same debate. Now, I'm not saying that it's never valid to talk about the difficulties of integrating new migrants or that it's always like racially discriminatory. What I'm saying is, for the most part, in our political discourse, when we have discussions about integration, we're not really talking about things like how can we ensure new arrivals can access jobs and education that is appropriate to their skill set and needs? What are we going to do about housing? What other kinds of welcome services might they need, etc.? We're almost always talking about reinforcing the border to prevent migration from groups that we perceive to be hard to integrate. In a way, the entire term integration is kind of a misnomer because we're very rarely talking about how actually to integrate anyone. And this is exactly what we see even back in the 60s. So, for example, a key issue that was often raised by politicians regarding Commonwealth migration in the 1960s is that there was seen to be this disproportionate concentration of migrants in certain neighborhoods, and these neighborhoods were in turn seen as becoming poverty and crime-ridden. Now, of course, the reality of the situation was that British landlords in the majority of the country were refusing to rent to anyone who was not white, which led to a situation wherein black and brown migrants ended up concentrated in the very few neighborhoods and towns where landlords would actually rent to black and brown people. A prominent example of one such neighborhood is Notting Hill in London, which, even though now it's overwhelmingly white and extremely affluent, back in the 1960s, this area had a very high concentration of predominantly Caribbean migrants, which is why, for example, the Caribbean Festival of Carnival is still held in Notting Hill every year. So the reason that migrant populations are being concentrated in small areas is because of discrimination. The British state knows that this is the case and are debating whether to do something about it as early as 1948, so before Commonwealth migration even really kicks off. But they refuse to pass any laws outlawing racial discrimination until over 20 years later in 1968. By which time the rights of such people to immigrate to Britain had been largely stripped away anyway, which again I think is not coincidental. Passing laws against racial discrimination whilst the border remained open to racial minorities would have been seen as incentivizing further inward migration from these groups. In terms of the party divides around outlawing racial discrimination, it was mainly the Labour Party who keeps pushing for these bills to be passed, and these keep being blocked by the Conservative Party until Labour are finally able to push something through in 1968, but again, largely because they had already conceded so much ground to the Conservatives on restricting the rights of Commonwealth citizens to come to the UK in the first place. So I'm going to read to you now a little excerpt from a parliamentary debate that happened in 1957, which was discussing a race discrimination bill that had been proposed by Labour at that time. The man speaking is a Conservative MP for Buckinghamshire South, and he says, "I wonder whether it is right for Parliament to intervene and prescribe the social attitudes of all people in the country. How do we know what is right as yet? The world is still young. We do not know to what extent it is right or not right to discriminate against people on those or other grounds. It may well be argued that a wise man discriminates on as many grounds as he can, that the peculiarly human quality is that of discrimination, and that we want is more discrimination, not less." I think that's a really interesting quote, because I think that nowadays there have been very concerted efforts to try and portray immigration controls as non-discriminatory in nature. They are supposed to be this kind of meritocratic system wherein you're in theory supposed to be allowed to migrate if you have enough of the desirable qualities. What this quote shows is, I think, the much more honest face of attitudes towards migration amongst some of the British political establishment. Outside of the far right, it's not really acceptable anymore to openly call for more discrimination towards migrants. But here we're seeing in 1957 a Conservative MP openly calling for precisely that in the House of Commons. Now, I'm highlighting this to show the catch-22 position that Commonwealth migrants were placed in. Commonwealth migration was positioned as untenable because of the alleged societal problems that it caused, and these allegations were used to justify stripping citizenship and migration rights away from these Commonwealth subjects. At the same time, the government was well aware of the root causes of these problems and refused to take action until these immigration rights had largely been erased. And again, I think that this is a pattern that we still see today, also particularly with wealthy countries in the global north, where it's really only after the border has been hardened that the attitude towards migrants can be allowed to soften. The perception of migrants as flooding a country, whether real or imagined, is used to justify their exclusion. And once they have been effectively excluded, the internal boundaries of who is within or without the national population can be redrawn. In essence, some of the states with the most generous offerings for migrants already in the country in terms of social and political rights, access to public funds, etc., are also states with the harshest border controls.